Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Haluska. As you can see from the hat, I work with the City of Charlottesville, where I'm a principal planner, and I'm talking to you today about public budgeting at the request of Professor Cockrell. This is a presentation I've given many times live, but this is the first time I've done it over the video. I like to start all of my presentations by talking about why you ought to pay attention to the topic, because I know when I was a university student, there were many topics that I didn't pay attention to. So I have two reasons beyond the fact that this is on your syllabus and you need to learn something about it. The first is that when you move on from the University of Virginia or whatever other educational institutions you may be thinking about attending in the future, at some point you're going to be a resident of a community. And when you are a resident of the community, I think, hope that you will be involved in the civic affairs of that community. Well, one of the civic affairs that comes up annually in just about every locality and is, quite frankly, a flashpoint for arguments about the vision of that community is the budget. And it stands to reason because the budget is how limited resources, such as money, which all local governments have a limited amount of, get spent. And that can cause differing visions of how a community spends their money, or different ideas of what they should spend it on can frequently lead to arguments. And this is an annual basis in most localities where the budget comes up and there are arguments about the budget. The second reason that I would suggest you pay attention is that the budgetary process that we use is, the underlying process anyway, is the same regardless of what level of government you're dealing with: federal government, state government, local government, nonprofit organizations, business entities, even your own personal finances. All the budgetary process is essentially the same. And by understanding that, regardless of what sector you work in, at what level, you'll be able to understand exactly how that process is working. And you can also apply this to your own personal life in terms of your personal finances. So it's something worth paying attention to. Humans are not great long-range planners. We have some genetic predispositions to making very good short-term decisions and really awful long-term decisions. And I'm sure we all know of people who've made kind of bad financial decisions, and in some cases our brains are kind of predisposed to making those bad financial decisions long range. Budgeting is one way that you can avoid that, by using the cognitive areas of your brain and creating a plan and sticking to it. So for that, I hope that you'll pay attention to this, understand kind of, at the end of this, you'll understand how budgeting works and why it applies to planning, which I will get to. But the first thing we need to do is talk about some definitions and terms.
So I'm going to use the magical visual element of money from the game of life to illustrate some of the terms that we're talking about. And I'm going to use this table to kind of show how they interact with budgeting. So the first word that we use is revenue. Revenue is, simply put, any money that is coming into a local government during the budget year. Now, we usually have multiple sources of revenue, so one stack is not going to do it for us here. That's more like it. Okay, obviously local governments have multiple avenues of getting money to fund their operations. The one most local governments primarily rely on is property tax. Now, we all know about real property tax, which is a tax on land and structures on land. There's also forms of personal property tax that tax cars or equipment in industries. There's also another avenue that local governments can get revenue. It's fees for service, which are direct charges to people that are using a governmental service, so that cost is not spread out amongst all the tax-paying citizens and residents in the community. They also use fines when people break rules, such as parking fees or parking fines. And then you also have intergovernmental transfers. So these are situations where the federal government or state government, or even in the case of the city of Charlottesville, Albemarle County, will hand money over to the locality in exchange for certain services, or in the case of the county and the city, the revenue sharing agreement in which the city agreed not to annex further land from the Albemarle County, and Albemarle County agreed to pay the city in exchange for that agreement. So here's a visualization that was created by a group called Smart-Cville that does a really great job of showing where the revenues for the city of Charlottesville come from. This is for the current budget year. So as you can see, The current budget year, the revenues increased by 5.8% over the previous budget year, or at least were projected to increase by 5.8%. We'll see how well that works in the reconciliation at the end of the year. But you can also see where the money's coming from. Local tax is by and far the lion's share of the revenue that the city is getting. But you also have some intergovernmental transfers, the revenue sharing agreement that I talked about previously, and even some other revenues that might come from different sources. So now that we've collected all this money, we got to find something to spend it on. Or, well, people are giving us taxes or paying their taxes because they're expecting some sort of service, right? So that brings us to our next term, which is expenditures. Expenditures are just what they sound like. Anything that a local government is spending money on is an expenditure. The budgets will typically list these out by service sector areas generally. So fire and police will be in public safety. Other departments will be found under other headings. Now, without looking, can you guess what is the biggest expenditure for most local governments?
Schools. If you said schools, you're absolutely right. Schools tend to make up the largest part of a local government expenditure budget. In fact, when you talk about development, a lot of times you'll hear the term fiscal impact analysis. Now, what that essentially means is the local government's looking at a proposed development from the standpoint of how much money are they going to get from tax revenue from the property taxes in that development versus how much services are they going to have to provide and the cost of those services. When evaluating low-density residential development, a lot of times local governments don't come out ahead on those. And the reason is low-density residential development tends to draw families. Families have school kids, and school kids are expensive. This is Burnley Moran Elementary School in the city where my kids go. Go Bobcats.
So once again, using a visualization from Smart Seville, we can see the city's expenditures for the current budget year. I want you to pay attention to a couple items on here. One, the overall expenditures of $189 million and the anticipated increase in expenditures for this budget year over the previous budget year of 5.8%. Those numbers match the other slide that indicated the anticipated revenues for the budget. And that's because the city is required by state law to have what we call a balanced budget. Balanced budget simply means that your anticipated revenues are matched by your anticipated expenditures. You're not spending more than you're bringing in. Communities that do bring in more than they intend to spend in the year will often bank the remaining amount of that in a general fund or a rainy day fund, as we mentioned previously. Additionally, you can see the other areas, all the areas where the expenditures are going, where the money's going to in the city during this budget year. Infrastructure and transportation relates to a lot of the utility works that might be going on, maintenance of roads, things like that. You have management, which is the people who are really telling us what to do, including our city attorney's office, but also our city manager's office. Financial and internal services are the guys who track all the stuff that I'm talking about right now. Healthy Family and Community is where our Parks and Rec department is. They're the largest chunk of that. And then Public Safety and Justice is obviously the Commonwealth's Attorney, Police, Fire, and then the big ticket item, as I mentioned in the previous video, schools.
Now, there's two other terms that you need to know regarding budgeting. The first is surplus. A surplus is when the revenues on one side of the budget are higher than the expenditures on the other side of the budget. A deficit, on the other hand, is just the opposite. Expenditures exceeding the revenues. Now, you'll hear these terms quite a bit in news media, with an organization, particularly a local government, may have a budget surplus of some sort. And it's important to ask yourself, where are they in the process of budgeting where this surplus has appeared? If they're early on in their draft budgeting for an upcoming year, well, that surplus is just showing the anticipated revenue that they're going to receive exceeds the anticipated expenditures. It's not real money. It's just imaginary. And there's plenty of situations where you can pass a budget going into an upcoming year with an anticipated surplus only to find out that that becomes a budget deficit in reality. Now, local governments, once they pass their budget, receive regular updates about how it's doing versus reality. typically a local government, if they start seeing a budget deficit that comes up about because revenues are sliding for some reason, or expenditures are growing for some reason, or there's unanticipated expenditures, they usually get on top of it pretty quickly. They try to make cuts where they need to keep their budget balanced and keep themselves not accruing a large amount of deficit, a much larger deficit that they have to deal with at the end of the year. Similar, on the other hand, if they do see a surplus developing during the year, they'll tend to leave it alone. And when they get to the end of the year, sometimes you can see these huge windfalls of a surplus when the revenues have been really good, particularly from taxes, and the expenditures have been kept low. Sometimes local governments will then solicit for proposals for what to do with their surplus. Surplus usually requires public hearing before it's allocated, and they'll get it flooded with all kinds of requests. Other organizations or local governments may just bank the surplus in a rainy day fund. Virginia, for a long time, has made a lot of fanfare about their rainy day fund. And then when they got to economic hard times where their budgets were in deficit, they were able to tap into that rainy day fund to cover the gap as opposed to doing other things to raise revenue, like raising taxes or fees or stuff like that. So now that we've covered some terms about budgeting, hopefully you could think about how and figure out kind of how the budget process might work. And this is, like I said, applies across the board in terms of which level of government's doing it, or even beyond the governmental realm into private and nonprofit areas. The budget process, if you're budgeting for a particular year, whether it's a calendar year, which is January 1 to December 31st, or a fiscal year, which is July 1st to June 30th, you want to have your budget ready to go when that date rolls around. So in the city of Charlottesville, we use the fiscal year. Our fiscal year begins July 1. That budget process for the budget that begins in July 1 will start the previous October with some projections being made about what we can anticipate in terms of revenue. And then departments are asked to look at their expenditures based on those revenue projections and develop budgets based on whether or not, there might be a 0% increase, 5% increase, or 5% decrease. In some cases, depending on how those revenue projections are. So as those projections are brought to the governing body, they will then reconcile based on the city's vision and goals as to whether or not they're spending money on where they need to be spending it, but also balancing that with the revenue that's coming in and making hard choices if the revenue is going to fall short of the goals that they have. You can obviously do this from a personal standpoint as well once you're out in the working world. You know how much income you're going to take in off of your job. You can kind of anticipate that for the 12 months. You know how much money it costs you to rent or pay a mortgage on a place to live, your food, your car, all those costs can be budgeted. And you can kind of create a plan for 12 months or 24 months of how you want to spend your money, particularly if you have some long-term goals.
So let's take a look at how a budget might be developed. The first step we're going to look at is our revenue. And for that, we're going to need our previous year's budget, what we anticipated to bring in, and then the actual numbers. So you can see here from this kind of rudimentary budget, we've got very small numbers for revenue, but nonetheless, the actual doesn't match the budget. And from those, though, we make a projection on the future year's revenue. And those projections should be based something on previous year's patterns or things like that, and other growth patterns and stuff that we've observed over time. You want to do the revenue first because until you know exactly how much money you anticipate having for your budget, you don't know what to spend it on, whether you're going to need to be making cuts in certain things or expanding spending, increasing spending in other areas. Good budget practice when it comes to revenue is you want to kind of aim a little low. You don't want to aim really low and kind of deflate your revenue projections, because most local governments want to use the full power of the finances they're bringing in to accomplish their goals. At the same time, you don't want to be aggressive, because if you do and your revenues fall short, you end up with a budget deficit, as we talked about earlier, and you're facing some mid-year cuts in those situations. This chart shows the city of Charlottesville's success in projecting their revenues versus their actual revenue that comes in on their previous year's budgets. And as you can see, the two lines are pretty close. when they do deviate, the actual tends to come in a little higher. And that's a good thing because once again, it means we're avoiding budget deficits, and we may actually have some budget surpluses at the end of the year to put towards some additional goals that the city might not have been able to fund during the budget. And here we have an example of what an expenditure line might look like. Once again, very simplified. Payroll is obviously one of the largest items that a local government has to deal with overall. It's the people that are working, but the benefits that they also accrue along with their salaries. Then you have the other options, items that keep the system running, supplies, utilities, and obviously a local government's budget is far more complex than this. Each department has their own sheet that goes on lines and lines and lines. But your budget ought to be based on what you spent the previous year with any explanation for deviation. So if your payroll number is coming in much lower than what you spent the previous year or what was budgeted, you're going to need to have an explanation that you're going to be able to give to the budget staff and the political leaders that are ultimately going to have to approve this budget, because they're going to be asking some questions. Similarly, if you have a large increase in any of your line items, there needs to be an explanation for that. Now, the one thing you're not going to see in here in this type of budget is any large projects, and we'll get to why that is in a minute. Once again, good budget practice here is you want to kind of aim high on your expenditure end. You don't want to find out that you need money and you don't have it for some sort of service during the year. And it also sets you up to be in a good position overall in terms of budget surplus, because it's much easier. If it's easier to come in under your budget, that's a good thing than when you run over a budget. Once again, here's the visualization showing the city of Charlottesville's budgeted expenses versus the actual. And once again, the lines are fairly close together. In fact, in FY 2015, they pretty much are on the nose. At the end of this chart, you'll see the expenses actually increase a little bit beyond the budget, which is something to be a little concerned about if you're a local government. Although if you recall, the revenues had also expanded. So there seems to be a correlation between expanding revenues and expanding expenditures at the city level.
Now, there's two sides to any local government's budget: the operational side and the capital side of the budget. The operational side is almost always much larger, and it includes all of the items that keep the city running or county running. So that would be payroll, your power bills, your internet bill, your phone bills, your office supplies, gas for all of your vehicles, anything that allows the people that are working for the city to do the job and provide the services that they are hired to provide. Operational budget should be drawn, if you're doing good budgeting practices, should be drawn from revenue, particularly revenue that is constantly coming in. So tax revenue, fee revenue, things like that. It should not be financed by borrowing. Anytime a city or county gets into a position where they need to fund their operational budget by borrowing, that's a really dicey situation to get into, because when you're borrowing money, you're going to have to pay back more than you borrowed in terms of interest, what you borrowed plus interest. And so that is kind of a spiral that can get out of control very quickly and lead to some really drastic situations for those localities. Capital projects, on the other hand, in the capital budget, are tangible projects, usually physical projects like sidewalk improvements, buying a new fire truck, building a new school, expanding a school. And in those situations, good budgeting practice allows particularly a well-managed locality to borrow the money to deliver that asset ahead of time when they need it, but then pay for it over time. It's rare that a locality can save up the money for a school expansion or a new school prior to delivering it. But they do have the capacity to borrow the money, put bonds out on the bond market, and I'll use that money to build the asset right then and then pay that off over time.
So this is just a line item that would show you kind of what a capital project budget is going to look like when you pull up a budget document from a local government. You'll see that there are several years of savings that go on before a project would actually move to the construction phase. So localities have a kind of couple options. One, debt, like I mentioned, where they need a large asset and they need it right away, and they are fine with paying that off over, say, 20 years into the future with a bond issue. But they can also, for smaller projects where they may not have all the money up front, just in a capital budget, indicate that over 5 years they will save up the money to, and once they have it all in the bank, they will then spend it to deliver that project. And we do this a lot in the city with sidewalk projects or other kind of smaller public improvement projects that we may not necessarily need right away, but we desire in the future at some point. Capital budgeting is also where the planning field most often deals with the budgeting process. Most capital improvement budgets will go to the Planning Commission for review, and that's so that the Planning Commission can review those budgets against the comprehensive plan that they're also supposed to be the specialists on, and make sure that the priorities of the comprehensive plan match the priorities that are being put into the capital improvements project and budgets for the future years.
So hopefully this presentation has given you some background into how the budget process works and some understanding in case you encounter it in the future. There's a couple points I'd like to leave you with. The first one is probably the most important, which is that the budget process is a form of planning. And in fact, it's probably the most important plan that any locality has. While the comprehensive plan talks about a city's vision and can talk about very lofty goals for a community, if that community is not spending their money on those goals, then that comprehensive plan is really just talk. So when you want to see what a locality really values, look at their budget and look at their expenditures in that budget. The second item is that the budget process, when you're doing a budget, there are certain kind of non-biased ways in terms of doing that process that are good practice. Those are really apolitical. But the process itself and the allocation of the money and how we gather revenues is a very political process. And that's one thing that I've seen change quite a lot in the years that I've been at the city. It used to be that budget hearings had the same three people that would always show up. We'd call them budget hawks, and they would usually complain about the level of taxation and how much money was being spent by the local government. But over the last few years, that's really changed. A lot of people have tapped into that first item that I mentioned, which is that the budget of a locality should reflect its priorities. And if a community says they believe in certain things, they ought to spend their resources on them. Citizens have figured that out, and they have come to budget hearings, and they're advocating very strongly for things that they think are important that they used to just kind of ignore. So it's a kind of an interesting time when you see budgets come forward, and it's interesting time to watch those and see who's in the room, what they're talking about, and what they're advocating for. I hope that answers as many questions as you may have, and if you have more, I'm certainly available along with Professor Cockrell to answer them, and I'll be seeing you around.